Tonight I introduce Jane Secker. There it is. I won't tell you any more about it because Jane would rather do it herself and I might get it wrong. Thanks very much.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Ian, and thanks for inviting me to come along to chat to you. It's going to be quite an informal talk, a bit about some of the international travels I've had going on conferences and things, and sharing some of the experience, particularly from going to a European conference on information literacy. It doesn't say on that slide, because I was going to kind of tell you a bit more about me in a moment, but I'm actually now at City University, so that's where I work in educational development. So I sort of moved across from the library world. I worked for many years at London School of Economics, and I worked in the educational technology team, so as a copyright sort of digital and information literacy specialist there, working with staff and with students on lots of projects. And I am the chair of the information literacy group. So Ian and I were just kind of joking a little bit about how ILIG and ILG quite frequently get confused. I think communications that are intended for ILG sometimes end up with Ian, and communications for ILIG sometimes end up with us as well, and we sort of we work it out just about, don't we? So yes, so I've been the chair for about 3 years now of the information literacy group, and that is kind of one of my main interests, and sort of I'm very kind of passionate about teaching and encouraging librarians to think of themselves as teachers as well. Okay, so I'll just tell you a little bit about kind of like where I kind of came from. So this is me now, or a few years ago, and this is me many years ago in West Wales, in Aberystwyth, where I went to study librarianship with history. I'm up, if anyone's been to Aberystwyth, I'm up Constitutional Hill, and looking down on the town, and had a fantastic time there. I'm really interested in history, and was also studying for an undergraduate degree in librarianship, because I thought I ought to make it useful and try and get a job at the end of it. And you know, my parents were particularly worried, what are you going to do with a history degree? And I was kind of so excited about it that I actually decided to do a PhD at the end of doing my undergraduate course, and followed this kind of route where I had 2 supervisors, one in information studies and one in history. I studied newspapers and how they were used by historians to write the press, to write history, but also the kind of role of the press, and sort of, you know, kind of how evidence might be judged when you're writing history using articles that are in the press that are obviously biased potentially. So it's kind of quite topical in some ways, but yeah, fake news and all that, and how historians worked out what was true and what might just be a rumour. I went from there actually to work on a British Library funded project, so I kind of decided at that point I didn't want to work in academia after spending a long time doing research, and there was just so many interesting projects that were around. It was kind of like just very late 90s, around 2000, and I went to work on a really exciting project at the Natural History Museum. It was funded by the British Library. It was looking at the needs of scientists and how you could kind of collaborate over collections. You know, as I say, there was quite a lot of research going on. And I went from there to work again on another project, this time at UCL. And this was kind of what led me, in some ways, into the field I work in now. It was a joint project with the education department and with the library, and they were looking at supporting students and how we could make course content of different types available in digital format, and to start investigating copyright issues. So really topical, really interesting, but quite practically focused, so not a sort of theoretical piece of research. It did actually lead to services that were set up at UCL after I left. And I went on from there to run some services at LSE, working with the team that were using the virtual learning environment, advising staff about copyright. I guess kind of what the theme here is that I was kind of continuing also to be very interested in doing research, and it was something where talking about the work I was doing and sharing with other people started to seem to be something that was quite important to do. And the library community is very good at that. Obviously, we organise lots of conferences and events for doing that. And that was something that I did on a number of occasions. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. I moved, so last April, to City University. And because I've been working really for the past sort of 15 years in educational technology, I really wasn't really working in the library field in many ways. And actually what I really am interested in is how people use technology, how they use it to teach, how they use it to share their research. And the post I've got at City is just ideal because I coordinate all the sort of courses to do with using technology in the classroom and encouraging staff, you know, to think about their own digital capabilities as well as their students. And then I also do quite a lot of other things. So some of you probably know, I mentioned the information literacy group, but copyright is one of my real interests as well. And I run a website with a good friend of mine, Chris Morrison, and it's called the Copyright Literacy website. So we've made a lot of teaching resources and materials available there, and we've been doing research in that field. And I'll kind of talk a bit about how that came about, which was largely through going to talk at conferences. So a bit of a roundabout way, but yeah, I mean, this is me kind of really back when I'm an undergraduate student, and I was thinking, is that when I got the conference bug? Because I was at Aberystwyth, and I got invited to go to, and did anyone study at the University of Wales at all? Anyone familiar? So there is an amazing venue called Griganoch, which is it's like a kind of, it's owned by, it's a house in the middle of Wales, in the middle of beautiful countryside, and it's like a conference centre that the University of Wales owns, and people from all the colleges will go there. They organise sometimes some of the sort of Welsh library events have been held at Griganoch. If you ever get a chance to go, I would say definitely go there. It's a lovely, lovely location. And I guess really it was, I went to an undergraduate history symposium with people from all undergraduate students studying history from different colleges. And I had a really fantastic time. That is actually a picture that was taken when I was there. It was quite, it was a bit rainy, and a group of us kind of out in the garden and sort of having a lot of fun. There was a bar. That was for later in the evening. And we played a lot of darts, I seem to remember. But we did also talk about history. So that was maybe where I got the bug from. And then the conference where I actually first attended and I presented at, because obviously I was just attending this conference, I was a PhD student, and my supervisor suggested I put in a paper. I was pretty much at the point I was about writing up my PhD, and he said, oh, there's this media history conference, it's in London. I was a bit scared, because I've been in West Wales by then for quite a long time, and he said, why don't you put in a paper to the sort of doctoral symposium to talk about some of your findings. And so I actually went to this conference very, very terrified, I have to say. I remember spending ages preparing some slides and rehearsing and things like that, but really, really exciting experience, because people had come. It was actually held at the University of Westminster, and lots of people came from different parts of the world that I met and were very interested in my research. And it was a really good experience. Then I guess thinking sort of when I then kind of, so that must have been in about 98, I think, when I went to that conference. And I was working at UCL at the time when one of my managers suggested to me I might want to present at a conference some of the work I've been doing about digital readings and copyright issues. And I went to a conference that's called ALT-C, which is the Association for Learning Technologies conference. It was in Edinburgh, and it was actually held on September the 11th, 2001. So it's quite memorable for many reasons, being at that conference. I have to say I still go a bit cold when I think about some of the things that happened on one of the days when I was there. But that's kind of that's really stuck in my mind, actually, as one of the first times I presented at that conference. But, you know, aside from the kind of dreadful catastrophe that was happening, actually, again, I did really find going to conferences something really quite rewarding. And then I went the following year. I was working at LSE by then, and I persuaded one of my colleagues that going to a conference would be a good idea to present. And she said, "Oh, we'll go to a conference." Yes, and I said, "No, we'll present." And she looked a bit horrified. And I said, "No, it's fine, it's fine. Honestly, it can't be as bad as what happened the year before. So let's go." And we went to a conference that was called ELIT, which was about sort of digital literacy in Glasgow, and we presented. And while we were there, they said that the following year the conference was going to be in New York. They were moving the conference to New York. Super, super exciting. And I did actually attend the next year and went to New York to this conference. So I was kind of really racking up, I think, the conference bug. So here's a map of the world, quiz time. There's no prizes. But I have to say that conferences for me do combine my kind of love of travel and meeting people and sharing what I know, you know, with the kind of sort of academic life as well. So where do you think I've got some continents of the world? Anyone like to hazard a guess about which of these continents that I haven't been to a conference in? Any ideas? Antarctica. No, I haven't been to. Yes, very good. I have definitely not been to a conference in Antarctica. No.
India.
India's not. No. Places. Yes. Okay, places. Yes. I have been to South America, Ian. I went to South America. I shall say a bit about that just earlier this year, and I presented at a conference. So yes.
Australasia.
Yes, I have been there, but I haven't actually presented at a conference. It's a very long way. I would quite like to, but I think it's also quite exhausting. I mean, going and presenting and having to go, even if you went for a week.
Yeah, it's a FaceTime, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. I've got the answers here. So I haven't been to India. I've been hoping to go to India for a conference. I did actually get invited a few years ago, but it was very, very short notice, and it was about the time when I was changing jobs, and I did turn it down. I've been to New Zealand, but I've never been to Australia, and I certainly haven't been to New Zealand for a conference, and I haven't been to Africa for a conference either. So there's some places on my wish list of where I'd like to go. Okay, I've been to a lot of conferences, mainly in Europe, I have to say. And the kind of conference, I guess, that is the one I was going to talk a bit about, which has, for me, been the conference that I found really, really massively rewarding and exciting, is this European Conference on Information Literacy. So it has this acronym, ECIL, and depending on where you come from in Europe, you pronounce it in multiple different ways. So some people call it ECIL, some people call it ECIL, some people call it ECIL, nobody really knows how to pronounce it, and I think it's to do with particularly the letter E being pronounced and I being pronounced in different ways in different languages. So it's a great challenge, even if when you're trying to explain to people which conference you're actually going to. But I'm going to tell you a bit about it. So this year's the only year I didn't go to it. It was in Finland, and again, because of the timing with the start of term at City, it was quite problematic. And I thought, I've been 5 years running, and I was kind of pushing my luck a bit. So I very sadly didn't go this year. But I'll tell you a bit about where I did go. So the very first year of the conference, and this is going back in, I think, 2013, the conference was held in Istanbul. So one of the conference organisers works at a university in Istanbul, and her and her colleague who came up with this idea, her colleague is actually from Croatia, so there's a kind of bit of a theme going on here as to where the first 2 years of the conference were, put this idea together, and yeah, very exciting, went to Istanbul, It was 2013, a time where there was quite a lot of unrest actually in Istanbul around the main square, and we were literally about 10 minutes walk north of there, so they were kind of advising us not to go out too much in the city, sort of down towards the square, and to stay further north or to get on the public transport to kind of avoid this area. So it's all a bit alarming, and it was in a military museum as well, which was, so it wasn't in a university, but it was a fantastic conference. And I think about 700 people went to that first conference from all around the world. So although it's called the European Conference of Information Literacy, I met so many people at that conference from all around the world. And I was working at LSE at the time, and I did present with my colleague Maria, who is there on the photo on the right. She's on the far right, and we did a lot of conference presentations together. And she pops up in quite a lot of the pictures I've got from these various conferences. So we went the next year to Dubrovnik when the conference was held there. They definitely have picked really amazing cities to hold this conference in, and that was us doing a sort of walk around the city walls of Dubrovnik. It was in a hotel that was actually on the beach as well, with swimming pools, and it was October time, so it was just about warm enough to go in the sea. Some people were sort of going for swims and things, but it was a fantastic conference, and that conference was really, really significant for me because it was kind of one of my key lessons I learned at the Dubrovnik conference, which was sometimes it pays to be a bit disorganised. And I was having coffee, and I suddenly realised the sessions were about to start, and I hadn't chosen what I was going to go to, and I randomly went into a room that I just didn't know what was going on in there, sat down, found somebody talking about this idea of copyright literacy and how much staff in libraries knew about copyright, and a survey, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. But it was literally because I went in the wrong room at the conference at Dubrovnik that it sort of opened many, many doors and a sort of a whole area of research that I've worked on now pretty much since then. So very exciting. I've got really good memories of Dubrovnik as well, and some amazing sites as well if you haven't seen the city. It's a lovely place. The next year, so this is where I've learned about copyright literacy, and you can see me and Chris in our copyright literacy t-shirts. So we went to Estonia and actually had done some research by then and presented this. This was in 2015 at a conference in Tallinn. I haven't got any nice pictures of the city there, but it's another really lovely, interesting city. And actually, it was an opportunity. There was a strand there where there was a lot of people who'd done surveys of copyright levels of knowledge amongst library professionals of copyright, and we were able to present the findings from our UK study and compare those to other countries. The next year was in Prague. This was, I think, a dinner, again, a lovely venue, and by then I've kind of got a whole gang of people, some of whom, you know, I kept meeting them year after year from all around the country. So there's various people from Germany and Austria in that photo that are kind of working in the fields of information literacy, people that I became very good friends with through meeting them at this conference. Fabian, who is here on the left, I think appears in another photo later, but he was, until this year, the chair of the German Information Literacy Group, and invited me, based on us getting to know each other at this conference, to present at the German National Library Conference that they hold in Berlin, which was 3,000 librarians in June. Immense, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. In the biggest hotel in Germany as well. Okay, yeah. So, you know, kind of building these kind of connections and these networks has been really important. And then this was last year. I went to the conference, so I've got this is Fabian again in this photo. We're great friends, and Serap, who is the Turkish lady who actually founded the ECL conference. Again, a really good friend of mine who I've known for sort of since going back to 2013 through this conference. And this is with some of the members of the Information Literacy Group. So we went and took some photos in St Malo down on the sort of overlooking the sea, and had a really wonderful time. So as well as kind of networking with international colleagues, there's quite a small contingent of us from the UK who went to these conferences, and again it's really good to kind of to build up the sort of social aspects and getting to know people. So yeah, I wanted to just say a bit about this. So this is also taken in St Malo, and this is what I'm calling the International Copyright Literacy Community of Practice. So going back to when I went in the wrong room in Dubrovnik, I kind of met all these people. This survey has now been done. So ECL is very good at encouraging multinational studies to be done in the field. So somebody will do a study in their country, and then they will use like the survey tool or something and share it, and be able to do some really interesting comparisons of issues across countries that are affecting the library world. And they've done this about quite a range of topics, but copyright and understanding of it is one where 14 countries have now been part of this study, and we've kind of built this, what we're calling a community of practice. And I think through the work that we've done, it's kind of led IFLA to recognise this also as to being a really important area of work. They issued a statement in August about the importance of copyright literacy, and it references the work that this group has done. And as I say, it came from, unfortunately, the lady Tanya Todorova, who's from Bulgaria, who did the very first study back in about 2012. And she was the one who was also one of the people presenting when I was in Dubrovnik. She wasn't able to make it this year, but she, you know, it has led to this work, you know, being done that's across all the different countries. So it's a really, really great community, and very exciting to be part of that. I just thought I'd show you a little bit about some of the things. So it was published last year, this article, and you know, you can see there's all the different countries and some of the sort of findings. So you could sort of see that across all the different countries, essentially, they were saying that librarians needed to know more about copyright. There were some key differences. So some of the countries came out where they were much more likely to have institutional policies, and where they had dedicated specialists, which we have lots of in the UK particularly as well. Confidence was higher, knowledge was higher. But pretty much across the whole of the countries, and I said, well, I don't want to say it's Europe, because it isn't just Europe. So it was so Mexico, the US, some other countries have done this study, and you know, across all those countries, the key finding was that it needed to be more embedded into the library curriculum as well. And as I say, there's been a lot of interest from IFLA on the back of this work, as this bit highlighting that it's not just a one country issue. So a lot of potential can come out of, you know, in some ways, chance meetings of people who are interested in similar issues. So yeah, I guess I thought what I would do was just sort of share a few things about what, you know, if you were thinking about presenting at an international conference, what I would say you might consider. I mean, I suppose for me, I just thought about what I was doing and whether there was a kind of unique take on it. It was quite easy when I worked at LSE to kind of be able to think of a kind of unique LSE take on something, I think. So I quite often would focus on something we'd done at my institution and sort of say, well, this is kind of one way we've done it, you know, which might be a different approach to what other people have done. And that was something I found, you know, even if other people just sort of said, oh, that's the same as what happens in it, you know, it's always useful to share what you're doing. And I think you assume that what happens in your own organisation is just common sense and everyone knows about it. But in fact, I've always found people really interested in the kind of, you know, like a kind of case study of what's going on in your organisation or your library. I did always find it was quite important, you know, to go to an international conference and give people a bit of context. So, you know, particularly if you're going and talking about the library sector in the UK and how things worked. So giving some national context could be quite important, and also particularly about your institution and where it is that you work. I didn't just assume that everybody knew that LSE was world famous and they knew what it was. And one of the things I used to always have to say to people was, it's all of the social sciences. It's that, because people would just have this idea it was about economics, and that was the only subject that was studied there. But there were sort of like interesting facts that you could use. So I'd say, well, this is interesting to talk about information literacy of graduates at LSE because 12 of our current world leaders were graduates of LSE. So surely we want those people to have information literacy skills. So I'd kind of use, be able to find a kind of unique angle. I always found acronyms and terminology, like you're talking to many people whose first language is in English. When you're all the conferences pretty much I've gone to, people would be presenting in English. I have occasionally been at conferences where they'll do simultaneous translation. The German conference, I have to say, it was mainly in German, and I could only go to the sessions that were in English. And similarly, I went to the Austrian Library Conference, and they got somebody to sit next to me and whisper in my ear when they were speaking in German, which wasn't the best way, actually, of experiencing the conference. I was at one earlier, like last month in Poland, and they had simultaneous translation, so that was really great. But, language can be a real barrier, actually, and I think even for many international presenters, you realise that even if they're very fluent in English, for them it's quite nerve-wracking to have to go and present in another language. And acronyms, are just the sort of thing that we love in the library world. So yes, some kind of things to consider there. I was trying to think about, well, how to get funding for this and how did I manage to do this? And it wasn't just because I always worked at LSE and they had plenty of money. I think sometimes you have to be quite imaginative about this and look for the kind of grants and the travel bursaries and things that are available. I mean, CILIP, and the groups do fund people to go to things, even if you only get a contribution towards that. And I think sometimes, we think it's going to be impossible, so you just don't look. But actually, certainly, the information literacy group, we've supported people to go to conferences. We have on our website that we offered bursaries for LILAC and bursaries to go to other conferences, and sometimes we'd get very few people apply. So, you stand quite a high chance, I think, if you apply for these things. So give it a go. There are also other sources of funding. At City, we're really being encouraged to think if we want to go next year anyway, using the Erasmus scheme, because who knows what's going to happen with it. So I'm having a look around, actually, at the moment to see if, because that's a source of funding that universities have that may well dry up. I guess sometimes I was a little bit cheeky that I put papers in for things and then told my boss, oh, I've just had a paper accepted here. I wouldn't do that now because we've got a very clear policy that we have to get approval before we do it. But I have to say I did do that, and I very rarely got told no after, well, okay, as you've had it accepted, well, we'll have to work out whether we can fund this. And yeah, just be prepared, to sort of to ask, and that's. I don't have any kind of magic because I am aware that is one of the biggest barriers. The other kind of really great way is to go to lots of conferences and get to know lots of people, and then they start inviting you to their conference and they pay for you. So that's the other thing that's happened to me in the last few years when I've been to some of the been to some of the conferences I mentioned in Germany, and the one I went to most recently in Poland, where they've actually invited me as a speaker. So and they funded me. So that's great. So yeah, what to do when you get there? Yeah, I've sort of said, hang out with the people you don't know. So I often would go with a few people from the UK I would know, but it was always really good to get as a networking opportunity and to kind of go over and chat to people that I just didn't know, because that was the kind of real benefit for me of going along and particularly going to papers from people that you're just not likely to ever, hear speak again. I remember being in Dubrovnik, and I would just deliberately pick papers from people that I'd think, well, I'm not likely in, the next year or so to go to India, so I'm going to go and listen to what they're saying, because, I think many of the times we sort of tended to, you want to kind of go to something that you think, oh, that sounds good, and that's a university a bit like mine, and but I've often at international conferences not gone to my colleague in the UK's paper, so I can go and hear somebody different. And yeah, networking is kind of the key thing, and I guess ask questions at the end of papers. If you're too nervous to do that, I often would go up to a speaker at the end and just sort of say, really interested in your work, and just want to say hi. And I've said, who knows where that might lead you? So that kind of leads me on to my kind of final point of who knows where that might lead you. It might lead you to Montevideo. So I went to a conference in 2017, just as I was leaving LSE, just in North London, in Camden. And I met the lady who's very smiley here. This is Virginia Rhodes. She works at the University of Montevideo. I met her. She was giving a paper and was talking about open education in South America and some of the work that they were doing at her university. And she mentioned open education and kind of how copyright was a real barrier in her country. And it just, my kind of radar went off, and I went up to her and chatted to her. And she actually said to me, you must come to Uruguay based on this conversation we had, and there is me in Uruguay. I got to go. She actually managed to get funding for me to spend a week at the university teaching on a course. This over here, this lady in the sunglasses on the far right, this is Alicia Ocaso, which I don't know if anyone's been to IFLA. She's the president of the Uruguayan Library Association. She's a fantastic woman. She's a real kind of advocate for open access, for kind of, access to knowledge and things like that. Really amazing, and she was taking me out for the day there. But this is me teaching at the university, the course I was running on copyright literacy and open education, and a group of the students who were taking the course. And so, yeah, who knows where it could take you. So that's it, really.
Thanks very much, Jane. Well, that inspired me. Yes, I've done a lot of the things that you said. Going up to people and just saying, I'm from England, and that's usually a good opener.
Yeah.
Even today, people really respect you from the UK, don't they?
I think so. Yes. Yeah.
I've actually done a speech in foreign language, in German.
Have you? Oh,
yeah,
wow.
from notes. But
that's really impressive.
Not really, but my son wrote it all out for me.
Oh, gosh.
And made a blooper, which they all laughed at.
Yes, yeah.
But he lived with it.
Yeah. No, I think I've managed to say sort of good morning in various languages.
Yeah.
When I was in Uruguay, many people didn't actually speak very good English. So I had a couple of the sessions I did when I was at the conference, they had a translator. And, it was something I was really aware of, even when I was teaching the people's English. I just had to slow down a bit and not use kind of jargon and kind of slang and things. So
a lot of people can't understand that I'm English because I don't sound English to them.
It's your Yorkshire accent,
that's
isn't
right,
it?
yeah. So they always think I'm from Ireland. I don't know that you get that with, you're obviously not from London, Midlands.
I'm from kind of Hertfordshire, so I don't know where my accent is now. So yeah. But no, they actually said they could understand me quite often. But I think I was quite conscious.
I've been asked where I learnt English. Your English is quite good. Where did you learn it? Yeah. Honestly.